The process of applied functional science is the transformation of the notion into the motion.
From the Gait Institute, this is the Gait Institute podcast. Gait Institute is internationally acclaimed for its innovation, development, mastery, and delivery of applied functional science, AFS. AFS is based on scientific truth, not theory, of how the human body moves in all three planes. AFS allows movement professionals like you to apply the best, most effective, and most efficient movements to any individual based on specific needs and goals. For 40 years, through training, education, and mentorship, Gait Institute has equipped over 150,000 professionals with comprehensive knowledge in the principles of applied functional science, AFS. Whether you're physical therapists, personal trainers, athletic trainers, chiropractors, strength and conditioning coaches, physicians, physiotherapists, occupational therapists, osteopaths, physical therapy assistants, or kinesiologists, our goal is to help you become the go-to movement professional.
Welcome to another Gait Institute webinar. This is a little bit different for me. Usually, I get the privilege of playing host, and sometimes I get to not only play host, but I get to kind of be a counterpart to the actual production. Well, I apologize, but you get to put up with me the entire time as the host and as the quote-unquote production. But I'm excited about this webinar, and on behalf of Gait Institute, I just want to thank you for not only registering for the webinar, but showing up for this premiere. The transverse plane is the power plane of motion. It's vital to our daily function. It's extremely vital in sports and, of course, performance training. Yet, it's usually the plane that's most often overlooked during training, as well as rehab and prevention programs. Unsurprisingly, though, this is the plane of motion that many injuries occur. So we definitely want to hone in our not only understanding, but our application of the understanding in what we do from a technique standpoint. Therefore, this webinar is entitled Transverse Plane Training Techniques. And the big rocks that we want to dive into over the next 40 or so minutes are as follows. Number one, chain reaction biomechanics and the transverse plane. Number two, principles and strategies for the transverse plane. And number three, training techniques for the transverse plane. In an industry that techniques dominate, many times we as movement professionals just want to be told what to do. This isn't a bad thing, but more importantly, we need to know why we're doing what we're doing so we decide what we're doing is the best for the individual in front of us. Therefore, we do want to identify the principles and strategies that the techniques follow so that we can get the best, not out of our own bodies, but the bodies in front of us, our patients, our clients, our athletes, the individuals, so that we as movement professionals can do what we do and decide what's best for them and facilitate the process. We're simply the guide to that patient, that client, that athlete, that individual being the hero in their own story. So as we dive into the chain reaction biomechanics in the transverse plane, I don't want to get too deep into it because I really want to ultimately get to the techniques. But when you think about how the good Lord put our body together, He gifted our muscles, our joints, to move in three planes of motion. Many times our muscles and joints get this persona that they're really kind of a one-plane muscle or joint because they have the most freedom. Look at the knee, for example, very sagittal plane oriented because of that flexion and extension has a lot of range of motion, but the knee is also a frontal plane joint and a transverse plane joint. All of our muscles and joints are triplanar. And it's really kind of the subtleties of the other two planes that really create the power, and that, of course, is why the transverse plane is so powerful. So if we just kind of took a gander at our own bodies and we looked in the mirror and said, yeah, we can move forward and back, we can move side to side, and we can rotate, really what we want to look at is when we rotate what's happening at the joints. If you look at that subtalar complex, or excuse me, the subtalar joint, it's also kind of a complex with the ankle because the ankle moves a lot in the sagittal plane, but it's that subtalar joint that makes up that complex that moves a lot in the frontal and, of course, that transverse plane. So we really care a lot about the subtalar motions of ab and adduction there at the foot. When we look at the knee, we do care a lot about internal and external rotation. When we look at the hips, we do care a lot about internal and external rotation. When we look at the trunk, we look at the lumbar, the thoracic, and the cervical spine, we do care a lot about right and left rotation. When we look at the shoulders and that nice ball and socket joint, we do care a lot about internal and external rotation, but we also care a lot about horizontal adduction and horizontal abduction. And it's those transverse plane motions that no matter if we're just talking about techniques or even assessment, we better make sure we put a spotlight on those motions, just like we want to put a spotlight on the sagittal and the frontal plane motions as well. It's interesting too because transverse plane is huge in everything that we do, especially when we're walking. So if we kind of just took a picture at the chain reaction biomechanics of gait, and when I kind of take that step forward with my right foot and my foot collapses, a lot happens here with the lower extremities, and many of those motions are given for free because of gravity and ground reaction force and mass and momentum. But when we look at when the foot collapses, that subtalar joint goes through eversion in the frontal plane, and relatively speaking, it goes through abduction in the transverse plane. What that does is it creates a torque conversion up the body where that frontal plane motion of subtalar eversion allows that tibia to fall in and starts the transverse plane reaction up the change that really loads our butt. So the knee kind of flexes and abducts and internally rotates with this step. The hip flexes, adducts, and internally rotates with this step. If we kind of look at this back leg, as this is kind of the transformational zone 2 of gait or of walking, we look and we know that now that subtalar joint actually goes through inversion in the frontal plane and relative adduction in the transverse plane, which really locks up the foot to give us kind of that stability, that foundation in order to push off. The knee goes through, of course, extension, it goes through abduction, but it also goes through internal rotation. And if you look at this hip, it goes through extension, it goes through abduction, but it also goes through even more internal rotation. So if we look at the front foot and we say, okay, there's relative abduction in the transverse plane at the subtalar joint, the knee's going through internal rotation and the hip's going through internal rotation. Okay, the transverse plane is really creating some cool power throughout my lower extremity. My back leg, the subtalar joint, of course, is going through relative adduction in the transverse plane. The knee's going through internal rotation and the hip's going through even more internal rotation. We should probably kind of focus in on the transverse plane while still focusing in on the other two planes. But since this webinar is on the transverse plane, let's kind of just take that understanding a little bit further and say, how are we now going to apply the knowledge or the science of applied functional science into techniques? And so you probably have seen this before if you've kind of hung out with the Gray Institute. If this is your first time seeing it, you're going to understand that this right here, this functional movement spectrum, in my humble opinion, is absolute gold, because it's really our map into where we want to go and how we want to do it to ultimately come up with the best techniques for the person in front of us. So at kind of a high 30,000 foot level, we look at this functional movement spectrum and we say, well, what is this thing called applied functional science? Well, it's stuff that's already been proven true. So it's very research backed. There's a lot of evidence here, and what we're talking about is the physical, the biological, and the behavioral sciences. And these sciences, when converged, create applied functional science and provide principles that guide our strategies to come up with the best techniques for the individual, which makes the movement functional itself because it's context dependent and it's specifically for the individual. So when we look at the functional movement spectrum, we kind of break up these principles at the top with the physical world. We do this bulk of principles in the middle, which is from the biological world. And then the bottom three, which are really exciting, really come from the behavioral world. And so from the physical world, we look at environment, gravity and ground reaction force, and mass and momentum. From the biological world, we look at motion and reaction, proprioceptors, muscles, joints, tasks, specificity, mobility, and stability. And then the behavioral sciences, we look at encouragement, empowerment, engagement. Why in the world, Doug, are you spending so much time on walking us through this? Well, because this is what's going to guide us in showcasing techniques in the transverse plane, because they have to have a purpose. All movement should be purpose-driven, and frankly, it shouldn't just because someone told you to do it. It should be that science shows us that this is going to be the best manner for this individual. So as I look at environment, and it's natural versus unnatural, as I look at gravity and ground reaction force, and we want to use it versus confusing it, and I look at mass and momentum, and we want to leverage it versus neglect it, I want us to look at this more from the transverse plane. When you look at the transverse plane, it's a little bit different in upright function than the sagittal and the frontal. The sagittal and the frontal planes, of course, are perpendicular to the ground, yet parallel to gravity, where the transverse plane is parallel to the ground, yet perpendicular to gravity. So when you think about that, many times it's gravity that's creating a lot of this motion, or maybe even thoracic flexion. The abs didn't do that, gravity did in upright. Or maybe this lateral flexion gravity creates. But if I'm moving in the transverse plane, I have a lot more freedom in upright because of the way gravity affects us. So we do want to take that into account on how we position movements and how we drive movements to understand what is gravity doing to the body. How is it challenging the body, or how is it enhancing the body? Mass and momentum is interesting because many times when we change direction and we have to decelerate this mass and momentum and accelerate it somewhere else, if we haven't focused in on the transverse plane, the body's going to say, whoa, 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 I haven't been here, I haven't done that. Many times that's what breaks down. If you think about the ACL, for example, that there's a lot of flexion going on, there's a lot of abduction going on, and there's a lot of internal rotation going on. If I look down at my knees, not over my foot, is that a bad thing? No, that's how it functions in real life. It's a bad thing if I haven't trained it to get into that position and come out. And the knee's going to depend a lot on, of course, the hip's ability to flex, adduct, and internally rotate, as well as the foot's ability to ankle dorsiflexion, as well as subtalar eversion and abduction. If I haven't had those transverse plane motions assist my knee from the bottom up and the top down and even the thoracic spine, it's not going to be a pretty sight. So we want to take that into account how we look at the physical principles. When we look at these biological principles, we know that motion needs to be three-dimensional versus one-dimensional. We look at reaction, and the body's a chain reaction. It's not just a link reaction. Proprioceptors, the neurological system, need to be turned on and facilitated, and it's movement that turns on proprioceptors. Proprioceptors that turn on muscles. Therefore, the muscles are reactors. They're not actors. And, of course, the joints need to be integrated in this neuromusculoskeletal equation. The task needs to facilitate a subconscious reaction, not necessarily a conscious reaction. The specificity, we talk about transformation versus stagnation, and transformation really means that change of direction, not maintaining a position like stagnation would allude to. Mobility and stability better be combined. They cannot be segregated. And then, of course, from the behavioral world, we talk about encouragement, engagement, and empowerment. And we'll talk a lot about that at the end of this webinar, because hopefully it's the techniques that are engaging, encouraging, and empowering, because they're engaging because of course, being relevant, not only to the transverse plane, but hopefully relevant to our patients, our clients, our athletes, the individuals. They also should be engaging and encouraging based on success, not failure. And they should also be engaging, encouraging, and empowering where there's an internal locus of control. So I'm scratching the surface here, and we can spend hours on this, but I want to spend time going through the techniques that stem from this. And that's really the name of the game, is the techniques that follow the functional movement spectrum and say, if these are the principles which turn into the strategies, this is what a technique could look like? I'm very specific when I say could. I didn't say should, because this is just going to be a bunch of examples. This could be something that you embed in your training program or your rehab program or your preventative program, because really movement touches all of those things. It's just how we tweak the movement for the purpose that really allows us to connect with the individual and what our end game is based on their needs, wants, and goals. So as we look at the functional movement spectrum, we're going to say, let's look at environment first. And we at Gray Institute say that any movement professional does not need anything but an open room to be successful. We love tools, we love toys, we love equipment, but if we really want to just use an open environment, a natural environment, what can we use to tell the most about the body? Now, I don't know about you, but I do like to work out. I do like to see what other people are doing. I do like to glean from what's going on. But if you looked around a workout room, a wellness center, there's a lot of machines and there's a lot of people probably moving, and our eyes would tell us that it's very sagittal plane dominant. In fact, I see people doing lunges all the time. We love lunges at Gray Institute. We love squats. We love jumps. We love it all. But when they're lunging, a lot of times I don't see people moving either side to side or even rotationally, but many times forward. Now, that's not a bad thing, but let's say take an anterior lunge, for example, and we know that there's a tri-plane effect going on throughout the entire body. That's kind of the first transformational zone of walking, which we talked a little bit about. But let's say if we really want to lunge, let's be complete. And by complete, we at Gray Institute say we could do a matrix. And a matrix is just a logical progression that takes into account 3 planes of motion. So if we're going to lunge forward, we can also lunge backwards. If we can lunge side to side, we can go same side lateral, we can go opposite side lateral. And then in the transverse plane, we can go same side rotational, and we can go opposite side rotational. Now the same thing goes when we're like lifting or reaching or even swinging our hands. We can swing our hands in the sagittal plane, we can swing our hands in the frontal plane, but we can also swing our hands in the transverse plane, which we got a lot of freedom there. So when we combine a lunge with a reach, that actually is, I'm wearing the shirt, 3D maps, three-dimensional movement analysis and performance system, where if we wanted to make sure that we're functionally moving the body to demonstrate its ability at the primary joint complexes of all the motions it can go through, 3D maps is it. No other assessment does that, by the way, which is why 3D maps is so empowering. But if I combined what we did, that same side rotational lunge, with a bilateral hand swing that goes same side rotational at shoulder, and you took a picture of this transformational zone before I came back home, you're going to see that the subtalar joint went through abduction. You're going to see that the knee went through external rotation. You're going to see the hip went through external rotation. You're going to see my low, mid, and upper back went through right rotation. And you're going to see my right shoulder go through horizontal abduction and my left shoulder go through horizontal adduction. Guess what happens when we now lunge opposite side rotational and take our hands in that same direction? If we looked at our stance leg, it's the exact opposite motions. We now have subtalar adduction. We have internal rotation of the knee, internal rotation of the hip. We have left rotation of the lumbar, thoracic, and cervical spine. The left shoulder is going through horizontal abduction. The right shoulder is going through horizontal adduction. We don't have any more motions to cover just by implementing the transverse plane from a lunge and swing standpoint, where we're going same side rotation and we're going opposite side rotation. And we need to have that not only in our assessment to be complete on how the body reacts, but more importantly, we need to leverage that success in our training techniques by including the transverse plane in what we do. Now, next one, gravity and ground reaction force. Gravity and ground reaction force, thank the good Lord for them, because gravity, we already said, gives a lot of motions for free when we go for a walk. It's all of our muscles then are trying to decelerate so that we don't fall over. So our muscles are working very synergistically all the time. But in this case, gravity and ground reaction force, I want you to think about when it comes to the hamstrings. The hamstrings get lengthened. They eccentrically lengthen when the knee flexes, when the hip flexes, but also when the knee and hip go through frontal and very important transverse plane motions, especially when you look at how the hamstrings are attached behind the butt and down behind the knee. It's very important to understand the hamstrings. So if you think about, have you ever tweaked your hamstring? Have you ever kind of felt like, oh no, my hamstring just seized on me, or it went whoosh? What were you doing? Were you probably changing direction? Maybe there was a fatigue factor, but many times it's the hamstrings that go whoosh, because we change direction, and when we change direction, we're recruiting more of the muscles within the transverse plane, and if we haven't trained the muscles to decelerate that, they're going to kind of freak out on us. And when we're now using gravity and ground reaction force by taking a step, maybe in this case a lunge, it's because our foot's squishing into the ground and the ground's pushing back that allows the knee to kind of move in the frontal plane as well as in the transverse plane, which is very important to note. So if we're really focusing on our hamstrings and we're not factoring in the transverse plane, missing the boat. Yep, sagittal plane we care about, frontal plane we care about, transverse plane we really care about as well. So if I'm going to be doing maybe just a simple lunge, if I'm lunging forward and I know how the hamstrings fire, how they eccentrically lengthen, and when I lunge, I know that my knee's bending and my lunging hip is bending, so there's a lot of flexion going on here. I know I'm getting good lengthening of the hamstrings. But what I can do, even just with a forward lunge, is say, how do I start to incorporate more of the transverse plane? One strategy could be that I go ahead and do that lunge with internal rotation. Or maybe I do that lunge with external rotation. So that internal rotation, I'm going to get more of the lateral aspect of the hamstrings. That external rotation of the foot, I'm going to get more medial aspect of the hamstrings. That would be a good way to slowly and surely tweak in the transverse plane. When I lunge backwards, the cool thing about lunging backwards now is I'm not only focusing on the lunging legs hamstrings because I'm still getting that knee flexion and hip flexion, but I'm also getting a lot of hip flexion over here on the front side as well as the knee. So I'm actually going ahead and covering both sets of hamstrings if I'm lunging backwards. This is kind of a fun fact. So I can go ahead and toe that foot in while I lunge. I can toe that foot out while I lunge to start to get more of the hamstrings. But if we really want to create more top-down drive with the hamstrings, we can use our hands, especially in the transverse plane, to do what we need to do. So when I'm lunging forward, I might want to take my hands down to create more flexion, but I'm going to want to rotate more to the right to get more lateral aspect of the hamstring. I might want to rotate more to the left to get more medial aspect of the hamstring to make sure that I'm lengthening the hamstring in all three planes while emphasizing the transverse plane. And I can do that same thing when I'm lunging backwards. So it's just a fun little tweak to say, maybe I want to toe my foot in or out. Maybe I want to drive my hands down and more rotationally if my goal is to protect the hamstrings while incorporating the plane of motion that influences it very powerfully and very subtly, called the transverse plane. Now, when we talk about massive momentum, this is kind of interesting and it's cool and it's exciting, but it's becoming a little bit more resurfaced in the movement industry, the idea of isometrics. So one good example of isometrics is, of course, the all-important plank, which is a great exercise. But if you ask your body, how often do you just maintain a position when you're doing something? It's not that often. So it's not that a plank is a bad exercise. It says, how can we take this good exercise and make it gooder? How can we make it better? How can we make it more functional? So one idea we could do is say, if we're going to go ahead and plank, and in this case, if we're just going to go hands and elbows, and I'm going to go ahead and maintain a really athletic posture, but I'm going to hold this position, the body is doing something. The body can do a lot more if we say, well, let's just go ahead and take the pelvis, and if we wanted to drive the pelvis forward and backward, we could do that. We could drive the pelvis side to side and do that, or we can say pelvis, go ahead and rotate right and left. And so while I'm maintaining this planking position, I'm picking a driver called the pelvis to facilitate more motion in the transverse plane, which is going to challenge the body more, but teach the body how to load and explode, how to lengthen and how to shorten. And that's a really good strategy when you talk about tweaking in the transverse plane into what we do. More techniques. And a lot of these techniques turn into matrices, which I already talked about what a matrix was, but all these movements can be a matrix where we say, we are talking a lot about the transverse plane, but why not factor in more of the frontal plane or the sagittal plane? So you'll see me factor in all the planes here moving forward, but I'm going to talk a lot about what the transverse plane influence means, based, of course, on these principles. So when we look at motion, motion should be three-dimensional, not one-dimensional. Okay that we focus a lot on one plane, but if that's where we leave it, we're missing out on the other 2/3 of the equation, relatively speaking. Think about your anterior hip or your hip flexor. How does the hip flexor get turned on? When we say turned on, we're talking about how does it eccentrically lengthen? How does it capture all that energy in order to release it? Well, the hip flexor gets lengthened and turned on with, of course, hip extension, ab and adduction of the hip, and, oh yes, internal rotation. So if you ever watch somebody do a hip flexor or a hip flexor stretch, this is kind of what it looks like. They might say, okay, I'm going to use this. I'm going to use these boxes, and I'm just going to go ahead and stretch out my hip flexor by going ahead and put this leg up, and I'm just going to kind of lean in. Not a bad start. But when you think about what life dictates, many times we're sitting down throughout the day. What happens when we sit down? Our hip flexors get shortened. What happens when we try to stand up and we go for a walk? Well, now they got to lengthen. Well, if they're already turned off primarily in the sagittal plane, they're going to get turned off in the frontal and the transverse plane as well, which makes sense that if I'm going to go ahead and stretch these bad boys out, that my down foot is naturally going to be toed out. Now, I'm exaggerating it here. But if you just ask your patient or your client or you yourself say, put your foot up on this step and we're going to stretch out the hip flexor, it's naturally going to be toed out. So one tweak that we could do for a hip flexor stretch is make sure the down foot is not toed out. Make it neutral, or if there's a motion available, make it internally rotated. So when I internally rotate my right foot and now I do a hip flexor stretch, I'm actually getting the hip flexor lengthened more because I'm already starting to tweak in the transverse plane. From this position, I could say, take my pelvis, drive it forward and backward. I can drive it side to side, and I can rotate my pelvis right and left to really get the hip flexor, but I'm also getting the lower leg as well. I could take my hands and do the same thing and say, go ahead and swing your hands forward and back, swing your hands side to side, and really swing your hands in the transverse plane to really go after that hip flexor. And that becomes more of a global stretch because I'm positioning the hip flexor in a lengthened position to lengthen it more in the transverse plane, while using that lengthening in the transverse plane, lengthening the sagittal plane, as well as the frontal planes, as well, of course, in the transverse plane. That could be a nice little tweak to understand what type of motion we need to facilitate, not only at the hip flexor, but the rest of the body. So when we talk about chain reaction biomechanics, it's really important to understand that muscles react and get turned on and eccentrically lengthen with the right motions at the joints. When we talk about reaction now, a chain reaction versus a link reaction, we want the entire body contributing to that because that's how the entire body works. Very rarely are we just functioning more isolated, and if I just have to look over my right shoulder, I'm not going to do this, I'm going to do this, and the whole body's going to go along for the ride. So think about the term the core. The core, by definition, or the abdominals, if you will, but we're talking about the core. Many times the books say it's everything but the extremities, where function would say it's everything including the extremities, because everything's got to go through the core because the body is a chain reaction. So I subtly said this earlier, but if I just wanted the trunk to flex, I just allow gravity to take over, because gravity is just going to pull my body forward, and now my whole body's going to say, whoa, don't fall over, Doug. People are watching you. They're going to laugh if they haven't turned this off just yet. But go ahead and accelerate yourself back. Now the core is starting to get engaged, but the abdominals, by definition, only flex the trunk if you're in a prone position. If I'm in an upright position, gravity flexes the trunk. So if I really want to focus on my core, I want to focus on my core, not only the front, but the back and all around, but as well as below and above. So what we could do is say, I'm going to take these weights right now, And I could take a very sagittal plane dominated exercise of a press or an alternating hand press or a reciprocating hand press and say, how do we make this better for the core, knowing that the body's a chain reaction? Well, if I wanted to focus on my front core, I need to know what lengthens my front core, and it's when I take the weights backwards, it's when I take the weights opposite side lateral, and it's when I take the weights same side rotational that my front core says, hey-o, I'm now joining the party. You're turning me on, you're lengthening me, and then I get to help accelerate back. Okay, that's pretty doggone cool. The best way to do that might be the all-inclusive, go same side rotational, and you're covering everything and creating more in the transverse plane of the front core. Well, the back core says, well, don't forget about me. The back core gets lengthened when you go forward overhead, when you go same side lateral overhead, and when you go opposite side rotational overhead. And it's that opposite side rotational at overhead that the core really gets turned in on the back because we're tapping into the transverse plane. Could be a little tweak to your exercise. Take something very traditionally in the sagittal plane and say, how can I feather in the frontal plane? And how can I feather in, of course, the transverse plane? Because the transverse plane is probably going to give us the biggest bang for our buck. Proprioceptors. Proprioceptors need to be turned on. They need to be facilitated. And in order for me to go turn on the lights, I can't just clap. Maybe I could, that didn't work. Or maybe I go over and I physically turn on the light switch. Movement allowed me to turn on the lights. Movement actually turns on the proprioceptors of the body. The proprioceptors then say, well, let's go ahead and allow the muscles to react so that the joints can be controlled within the movement. It's a pretty doggone cool chain reaction. But when we talk about proprioceptors, we want proprioceptors being facilitated very authentically. And a way to kind of turn on our proprioceptors, but understand that the proprioceptors are facilitating a chain reaction throughout the body, is we want to turn them on in an authentic manner that allows us to maybe focus on a body part and allow that body part to enhance the rest of the body. In fact, this is kind of the core to what we do in our certification in applied functional science, CAPS, that we take something and we say, how do we kind of isolate a certain body part while then integrating it throughout the entire body so that the entire body can reap those initial benefits. And in every step of the way, which we usually have like 4 steps, 4 processes, say start here, go here, go there. As we go along those steps, more proprioceptors are being turned on because we start with a local movement and we make it more and more global. So here's an example of what that initial local movement could look like within the foot and ankle. Is if I took kind of a traditional calf stretch and I go ahead and push against the wall, we have to say, what are we really trying to do with our foot and ankle complex? Well, our foot and ankle complex, you already know what happens when we go for a walk. That we need good dorsiflexion with subtalar eversion and abduction. And then when that foot's behind us, we need even more ankle dorsiflexion, now with subtalar inversion and adduction. So we really need the foot to be flexible and mobile, but then we really need that foot to be rigid and a propeller, if you will. So what we do here to really start to turn on those proprioceptors down there is we're going to go ahead and do the traditional calf stretch, but I simply say, okay, take your knee and go forward and a little bit back, go side to side, and then most importantly, take your knee and rotate it in and rotate it out. Of course, when you see it rotate in, wow, that's kind of what happens when my foot's in front of me when I'm walking. That's cool. When I take my knee and I roll it out, wow, that actually looks like what happens when my foot's behind me when I'm going for a walk. So we have all of our bases covered, but it's that transverse plane motion that really does a lot of the trick for us. By even just driving the knee in and out, we're saying we're picking a local driver so that a lot of the motion can go down there and influence the foot and ankle. But now the important thing is to allow that foot and ankle to talk to the rest of the body. So the progression here, as we start to tweak in more of the body, might say, let's go further away from the foot and ankle with a driver to still facilitate the same reaction, but start to get more of the body involved. So one thing that we could do is instead of driving the knee, is we drive our pelvis again. That thing's showing up again, not only just from the plank, from right here, and we can drive our pelvis forward and back. We can drive our pelvis side to side, and then we can really rotate our pelvis. Another thing we could do is allow this foot to do the driving forward and back, side to side, but then rotate, and we're starting to get more of the whole body. Here's where the magic really happens. As I'm driving my knee a little bit, as I'm driving my pelvis more, and as I'm driving my other side foot more, the thoracic spine is doing this the whole time. Thoracic spine is starting to be mobilized in the transverse plane, which is one of the most important things that we can do, is make sure our thoracic spine has ability not only flexing and extending, right and left laterally flexing, but right and left rotating, especially if we're walking, because it's the transverse plane, especially at the trunk, that generates a lot of mass and momentum so that we can become more efficient in our walking. But many times our thoracic spine is kind of that hidden gem of the body that might either be the biggest way to help the body, because right now it might be turned down and it's hindering the body. So looking at the foot and ankle, it's not just a foot and ankle stretch. It's a foot and ankle technique and movement that we tweak so that now what we might do is come off the wall and say, let's do the same thing with our foot and ankle. Remember those lunges I talked about earlier? Well, here's another reason why we should do that, and there's another reason why it should be part of your assessment, is when I go ahead and go forward, dorsiflexion. When I go backward, plantar flexion. When I go to the right, subtalar inversion. When I go to the left, subtalar eversion. When I rotate right, abduction. When I rotate left, adduction. I have my ankle subtalar joints in tune right now in all three planes because of going through a lunging matrix. Well, that could be a progression off the wall to say, I'm going to now do lunges so I have 2 feet in touch with the ground in my transformational zone, because I had a lot more stability on the wall. Now I got less stability out here. And maybe I do those same thing now with the toe touch, which those things will show up here in a little bit when we talk about mobility and stability. But from this principle standpoint, is we're starting to turn on as many proprioceptors as possible, the more global we make the movement. And many times we can create even more of a global movement by honing in on the transverse plane. Next, we got muscles. Muscles need to be reactors, not actors. Now, if you look at the bicep and you look at the triceps, and you say, well, what are they really known for? Well, if I really want my bicep to pop, what I need to do is say, it's going to pop if I can flex my elbow, if I can flex my shoulder. But do this right now. Go ahead and give me a flex here and hold that bicep. And all I want you to do is take your wrist and throw it out. You just got stronger. Magic. It's great to work with kids. I got an 8-year-old at home that does that. He goes, look, not big, big, not big, not big. And I'm like, okay, you're starting to know your biomechanics. It's in your blood. It's great. But that's the great thing about it is we need to look at muscles being triplanar, not just a sagittal plane thing. So if we took a simple curl, we could do 2 strategies to really start to hone in on the transverse plane. Is we not only need to curl forward, we could curl to the opposite side in the frontal plane, and we can go opposite side rotational in the transverse plane to really get our bicep to fire in all 3 planes. The second strategy that we could do is say, no matter if we're curling forward or to the opposite side or opposite side rotational, is in that transformational zone, go ahead and curl with forearm supination. Curl with forearm supination. Curl with forearm supination to really start to enhance the bicep. In this case, not only the muscle group, but more importantly, in conjunction with the rest of the body. So you can kind of load and explode with this bicep matrix going forward to the opposite side and then opposite side rotational. But my body's kind of bouncing a little bit. It's not cheating. It's loading and exploding and allowing the rest of the body to help the arms and the arms to help the rest of the body. So think about the triceps now. Triceps, of course, if you extend your elbow, extend your shoulder, you're going to get those bad boys to pop. How do you get them to pop more? Roll your wrist inward or pronate your forearm. So now you could say that could be a strategy. That little forearm pronation in the transverse plane is really going to get my triceps to pop. But I can also say, well, I can take it backwards, I can take it to the same side, and I can rotate to the same side. But while I'm doing that, what I may want to do, of course, is do that with forearm pronation, tweaking in the transverse plane, hitting the muscle groups more authentic to how they need to react, and getting more bang out of my buck. Next thing we could do, we got task, subconscious reaction. Actually, no, not task yet. We got to go joints first. Good thing I got this. Good thing I got my cheat sheets. Bear with me. We're going to keep flying through. But we now have, of course, what we call the joints. They need to be integrated, not isolated. I gave you an example earlier. Hey, Doug, I got to look over my right shoulder. Don't do that. I look and say, what's going on? The whole body reacts because the whole body is an integrated unit of joints. It's not isolated. So if we're going to do an assessment or even an enhancement to an assessment, and we're looking at the cervical spine, and you do this, and you do this, and you do this, you're missing the whole point of the body, that it's the thoracic spine, it's the hips, it's the foot-ankle complex that's going to make the cervical spine much more efficient. So if you look at the cervical spine in the transverse plane, and we really want to enhance rotation right and left, what we're saying is we not only want rotation at the cervical spine, we need rotation throughout the entire body to give the cervical spine a buffer zone so that it doesn't get hurt, it doesn't get pinched. One way we could do this is the cervical matrix. So you could self-assess and just say, well, how far can I look around the corner to the right? How far can I look to the left? I know where I'm at. And this could be the progression. We do those same side rotational lunges that you saw earlier. It's one of the 6 chains in 3D maps. And we allow our eyes to follow our hands. And we do that a few times as fast and as far as we want. Then the progression could be, don't let your eyes follow your hands. Let your eyes stop on those 90 degrees. So my eye stops right 90, my eye stop left 90 as I do those same lunges. I can do those as many times as I want, as fast and as far. Next progression, you're already starting to sense your eyes followed your hands, they stop there. I'm going to stop now on the 45s as I go to the right, as I go to the left, and do that a few times. And then last but not least, I can just stare you down right now, make sure you're watching me, and say I'm going to do that same lunge, and I'm going to go ahead and keep my eyes fixed on you. What I'm really doing is I'm focusing a lot on cervical plane motion in the transverse plane, but I'm focusing even more on the rest of the body to give me more transverse plane motion, which gives me more frontal plane motion, which gives me more sagittal plane motion throughout all the joints to assist the cervical spine. So I do care about the flexion and extension, the right and left lateral flexion, and the right rotation and left rotation of the cervical spine. But I care more about how it does it in conjunction with the rest of the body, because that's how it happens in, of course, real life. Task, subconscious reaction. I need you to tighten your glutes. We really shouldn't have to think about tightening our glutes because that doesn't really happen in real life. I could go for a walk and guess what? My glutes are tightening. Because how do our glutes get tightened? How do they lengthen? Well, with flexion, adduction, and internal rotation. So if we wanted to simply just take an anterior lunge, we know that we're actually tightening our glutes by doing that lunge. That's why it's a great exercise. But if I wanted to get it tightened more, and I didn't have to think about it because it should happen subconsciously, I might want to tweak it more in the transverse plane. You already saw one of these examples. Do that lunge when we were talking about the hamstrings, and I want you to internally rotate in the transverse plane your right foot, because what does that do right now? Creates more internal rotation of my right hip, which lengthens my glutes more in the transverse plane, getting them more tight so I don't even have to think about it. What could we do with our hands? I could do that same lunge forward, I could toe it in, and you can take your hands and do a right rotational at shoulder reach, tweaking in the transverse plane to create more internal rotation of that lunging hip to get our glutes to fire more in the transverse plane and tighten those bad boys up. It's a transverse plane tweak, but we have to, of course, start to know how our joints need to move, and when our joints move, how our muscles are going to react so that it's a subconscious reaction. Next thing, we talk about specificity. specificity, we could talk about maybe running. And when you look at running, it gives us a glimpse of a great strategy. How do the shoulders and the pelvis react to one another in a certain plane of motion? In this case, transverse plane, you got it. So when I go for a walk or I try to run, my right foot goes forward, my pelvis rotates left. My left hand goes forward and my shoulders rotate right. So my pelvis is rotating left. My shoulders are rotating right. They're actually rotating opposite one another in the transverse plane motion or transverse plane to allow that massive momentum to accelerate and go with the other side. So it's really interesting to look at that strategy to say, okay, if we look at the transformational zone specific to running, and we look at the transverse plane of the pelvis and the shoulders, and they're counter-rotating, how does that replicate in our training techniques? Well, if you look at our 3D maps lunges, which we go the anterior chain reaction with the hands going back, we go with our posterior chain, we go with our same side lateral chain, we go with our opposite side lateral chain, we go with our same side rotational chain, we go with our opposite side rotational chain. A tweak to make those lunges more specific to running could say, let's just drive our hands in the transverse plane, but we can't just drive them to the right and left where we feel. We need to drive them to the right and left relative to the trunk, counter-rotating to the pelvis. So if I'm doing an anterior lunge, I'm going to take my hands and I'm going to rotate to that same side at shoulder to get my pelvis rotating one way and my trunk and my shoulders rotating the other way. When I lunge backwards, I'm going to take my hands in that opposite direction in the transverse plane to get that same reaction. When I go same side lateral, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually take my hands to the other way in the transverse plane, because when I go opposite side lateral, I'm rotating my hands to the right with my right foot going to the left to get that reaction. Transverse plane, we're going to just take it opposite of our lunge foot, no matter if we go same side rotation or opposite side rotation, because what we need to do is be specific. Specific adaptation to imposed demand also carries over and says we need to be specific to the task at hand, because nothing's more functional than the actual thing. But if we're training for that thing, what's our strategy to make it look like that thing? In this case, the strategy is look at the transverse plane relationship between the pelvis and the shoulders and allow those transformational zones to be replicated in the movements and the techniques that you're doing. In this case, if we're using lunges, just have your hands rotate in a manner that allows your pelvis and your shoulders to be counter-rotated in the transformational zone. And we get that way, of course, by focusing more attention in on the transverse plane. Mobility and stability. It's not an either-or equation, mobility and stability. What may be more emphasized for mobility for one person might be more stability for another person, but it's really one spectrum. It's how we tweak the movement that really can emphasize what we're doing within that spectrum. Think about injuries. Many times injuries occur not only in the transverse plane, but many times it's not because the motion wasn't available, it's there was no strength to control the motion. So if we go back and what we did in an open environment within 3D maps and focusing a lot in on the transverse plane and said if we took those lunges with hand swings, whether going in the sagittal plane or we're going in the frontal plane, but we're definitely going to go in the transverse plane, how do we leverage the success of the body and say we're going to emphasize more stability? Instead of doing a lunge in those 6 directions, we would do a foot reach at ground, not only forward, but backward, side to side, and of course, rotate and rotate. And let me just talk about the rotate and rotate. When I rotate same side rotational here with my right foot, I'm really exposing that front butt. And yeah, we call it a front butt. And we talked about the back butt, the glutes getting turned on with flexion, adduction, and internal rotation. Well, the front butt gets turned on with extension, abduction, and external rotation. And those are really tough motions because we don't have a great big muscle glob compared to our back to decelerate that. So especially in that rotational, going this same side rotational, it's a tough move that we definitely want to start close. We want to start at a comfortable speed, but then we want to expand based on success and use that toe touch to say, what do you have available, body? And then as you're comfortable, we don't need to toe touch. We can go ahead and reach at ankle and come back home, reach at ankle and come back home, and we can use our hands as well. But that's a natural progression to start to emphasize more stability. But what we're doing is we're saying, in this case, we're really emphasizing external rotation to say, not only can you get there, but can you come back? And because the whole body's involved, it's not just the hip we're focusing on. We do care about the knee. We do care about the subtalar ankle complex. We do care about the low back, mid back, and upper back. We do care about the shoulders. In fact, everything's involved when we do that, but we want to make sure that we can empower all the joints of our body to not only use the motions that are available, but the whole body can control the motions. In fact, it's that extension, abduction, and external rotation that usually is the forgotten aspect of training, which may be why we have so many ACLs, why we have so many labral tears, why we have so many sports hernias, is because we're not emphasizing enough, not only in the transverse plane of external rotation, but also of extension and abduction. So when we go this opposite way, our back butt's saying, whoo, I got a lot to decelerate there because I got a lot of muscle mass back there to get you into internal rotation and come back home. But we do need to take that step in our training by saying, not only focus on the transverse plane with the sagittal and frontal, but we have to focus on mobility, but we have to also focus on stability so that the body can demonstrate most of its ability and be safe in the process. Whew, this is fun. We're almost done. It's great, but I'm not going to talk about movements for the last three. When we talk about encouragement based on success, empowerment based on internal locus of control, and engagement based on relevance, what I ultimately want us to understand is that's where it gets really exciting. That's where we as movement professionals have so much fun, and because we can vary our movements, not only to create the spice of life that variety creates, but more importantly, to continue to take our patients, our clients, our athletes, the individuals on this continuum of ongoing success for more encouragement, allowing them to be in control for more empowerment, and ultimately using movements that are relevant so that they're more engaged in the process. Understanding the ability that we have not only just in the transverse plane, but the opportunity that we have to learn more about these principles, to use these principles as a strategy to come up with an infinite amount of techniques, is where it gets even more exciting. But our goal as movement professionals aren't just to be told what techniques to do. It's to come up with the best techniques for the individual. You know the individual better than anybody when it comes to movement. And now, of course, with applied functional science, you're able to say, this could be how I tweak more into my programming, whether it's a prevention programming, a rehab program, or a performance program. Not only think about how you can tweak in the transverse plane, but think about how we can leverage all these principles to ultimately tweak our programs to continue to do what you're already doing so well, and that's using movement and to enhance the life in front of you. We get excited doing these webinars because we do enjoy teaching, but we also enjoy learning. Now, the excellent thing about these webinars, especially when we're premiering them, is we usually have this exclusive opportunity at the end. The exclusive opportunity is one you probably have heard about, but the best news is it's free. What I encourage you to do, if this is the premiere that you're watching, if you're watching this on the app, you're already going to kind of giggle, but if you're watching this on the premiere and you're not on the Gray Institute app, my encouragement would be to subscribe to the app. It's free, but here's the cool part. There's other professionals like you on that app that want to learn, and more importantly, we want to share. There's this huge thing on the app called forums that we want to encourage you to use more of. A lot of times it's very one-sided where Gray Institute professionals are the ones kind of posting information or posting questions. Our vision here at Gray Institute is to make that forum two-way. We want people that may already be a part of Gray Institute to teach, but also to learn. We want people that are starting to come into Gray Institute to teach and to learn, but really create that banter, that communication, which ultimately should reflect those three behavioral drivers of being encouraging, empowering, and of course, engaging. And that's really the exclusive opportunities. If you haven't jumped on that app, don't have anything to lose. It's free. Jump on it. But there's more bells and whistles to it. There's more information on our certifications and our specializations. And guess what? There's actually a remote exercise library on there where you can send your patients and your clients and your athletes exercises that we either have in-house or you can create on your own. There's a lot of bells and whistles on this app, and I would just encourage you to take advantage of that. But as this webinar comes to a conclusion, I just want to thank you for, again, tuning in. It's fun doing this solo, but it's even more fun doing it with other people around me. But it's even more fun no matter what, knowing that it's for, of course, you, the awesome movement professional. So think about the transverse plane. Think about the implications of the transverse plane. Think about how we can start to tweak in the transverse plane to come up with even more engaging, encouraging, and empowering techniques, because it's just going to continually influence and enhance the lives of those that you serve. And for that, we at Gray Institute honor you, we thank you, and we want you to know that we're proud of you.
Thanks for joining us here on the Gray Institute podcast. At Gray Institute, our goal is to do one thing the best we can, and that is to help you become the go-to movement professional. If you have a question for future podcasts or questions about anything Gray Institute offers, including education, live or online specializations, or mentorship, please email us at info@grayinstitute.com. Be sure to look for our next podcast coming soon. Have a great day.